When they no longer compete with each other, this is called resource partitioning. And once again, they would have to communicate with each other in some way that they don't want to threaten each other. Partitioning means to split or compartmentalize. So there's this species of birds called warblers. They survive in different parts of pine trees. And just naturally, they have separated themselves. So some of them take the top part of the tree, some of them go deeper inside the branches, and some stay out on the edges and so on. It's called an adaptation. And in this case, it's more of a behavioral adaptation. But we can have physical evolution as well, which leads to competitors coexisting. And when that happens, we call it specialization, adaptive radiation. The species have evolved in a way that allows them to stop being competitors. Now, we see this no better than where Darwin traveled, the Galapagos Island. And remember, islands are limited in resources. That's a problem. If they don't specialize, they will go extinct. So the finches are the classic case that Darwin presented. He showed that all these birds are technically related, but you look at their beaks and they are completely different. Some of the beaks are made for reaching inside of trees or soil and pulling out worms and insects. Other beaks are much sharper and more blunt, and they're made for cracking open seeds. We've got some that are better for eating fruits and flowering buds off of the plants. So the shape of the beak is what caught Darwin's attention. And remember, evolution happens faster in those island sections. We speed up evolution when we separate species. So that trip that he took was so important in locking down this idea of physical adaptation, specializing. Now, when we look at birds all over the world, we see, well, yeah, their beaks are so important in terms of how they fit into an ecosystem. Okay, so what we're describing here is actually called a niche. A niche is when a type of organism adapts to use a different part of the ecosystem or to have a different role in the ecosystem. I think of the niche as their job. And of course, their habitat then is where they live. Now, a very interesting animal is the beaver, because a beaver's niche is also its habitat. Constructing a dam provides a service for a river ecosystem, but it's also where they live. It's one of those reasons that we consider beavers a keystone species. Without them, the river ecosystem falls apart. We need to be able to dam and flood to bring nutrients to the riverbanks. When we look at an animal and we look at all the possible places that it can serve its role, that's called its fundamental niche. There are some mollusks that live on a cliffside by the ocean. Now, we're landlocked here in Indiana. I know a lot of you have traveled to the ocean, but I don't know if you've been in a place that experiences vast differences between high tide and low tide. The water comes in, brings food and nutrients, and then it goes out, and they're able to survive until it comes back in. So these brown mollusks are able to do that at all kinds of different levels. They're very adaptable to multiple conditions. But along comes their cousin, the blue mollusk here, and it is not as versatile. It needs water more often. And so it is not able to live way up high on the cliffside. It's got a much smaller niche. It, however, happens to be dominant. It's a stronger competitor. And so the brown mollusk simply gets out of its way. It's decided, yeah, you're bigger than me, you got this. I'm not even going to try to fight you. Okay, so even though the brown mollusk has a big fundamental niche, due to competition, its realized niche has shrunk significantly. It's capable of being down in those low tides. Competition simply does not allow it. So I guess the big takeaway here is that the realized niche is always smaller than the fundamental. It could be equal if there's no competition, but if there's any form of competition, it's always smaller. This is really the same thing, just presented in a different form. So College Board might give you a graph like this, and you can see we have two competing species that have different seed sizes. They overlap. Whichever one is the stronger competitor is going to push the niche of species 2 smaller. So that's the shrinkage that occurs there due to competition. So this is the fundamental niche, and this is the realized niche. But this is a classic bell curve, and so was the previous picture. So you've got this area, certain conditions, and it might be things like temperature, dissolved oxygen, pH, amount of moisture, amount of sunlight. It doesn't matter, all things that keep us alive. And obviously there's an optimum range where the organism is going to thrive. So that's the preferred niche. And then eventually you get to where, okay, well, it's getting a little too cold or a little too hot. And it's going to vary, even within a species, that's going to vary, right? My wife is always cold and I'm always hot. So it doesn't work out very well in our household. But that's called the zone of physiological stress. So you start to become uncomfortable. You could even get sick in these ranges. Typically, though, you can still tolerate it. It's not going to wipe you out. But at some point it will. It'll kill you. Okay, and so that is the zone of intolerance. So one way that we can classify species is whether they are a generalist or a specialist. And you can see this overlaps with the concept of niche and tolerance. So humans are actually, we're generalists. We exist in a lot of different roles in the ecosystem. We are pretty flexible to conditions. We can adapt because of our ingenuity. Invasive species tend to be generalists. They can go to a brand new environment and figure out how to thrive and outcompete everything that's there. The term keystone comes from a Roman arch, and it's that stone you drop right in the middle at the top, and it holds the rest of the arch up. But if you take that stone out, the whole arch collapses. The same thing is true in an ecosystem. And sometimes a keystone species is an indicator species. It's an indicator that change is happening. So the classic idea of a canary in a coal mine. Algae blooms, right? We know there's too much of a nutrient if algae starts showing up. Peppered moth is one we're going to learn about next week. So here's an example of why lichen are important. They're one of the very first things that forms in an ecosystem. But it turns out that their color and their complexity is an indicator of how much sulfur is in the air, which has to do with acidity or pH. And I know a lot of first-year ecology programs at colleges will have you go out and do this as a lab. You will go out to a creek and you will flip over rocks and you will look for macroinvertebrates, little insects and things that live in the water. And you're able to tell very quickly by what lives there and how big it is, what kind of water quality it is. If you've got things like leeches and black flies, the water is trash. If you've got stoneflies and mayflies, which are more complex organisms, then the water is biodiverse and much healthier. So a very fast way, if you can identify a few bugs, to know if the water is healthy or not.